too deeply into topics, there's just some things I want you to consider. We can think of these as principles of motivation. Obviously, we're here to try to figure out how we can be catalysts for the people around us and help motivate them. And so along those lines, I want us to consider that people motivate themselves and are inspired by others. So there's nothing I can do behaviorally that will intrinsically motivate you, which we'll talk about. But I can be a certain way that inspires you to, or aligns with the ways that you're motivated, and can increase your motivation. The other thing I want to think about here is that commitment to a task or a plan or an idea is always voluntary. So especially if you're managing, right, that we would hope that giving people the work that we have to give people is motivating, but that's not really under our control. And what's underlying that motivational response is their value systems, and we'll talk more about that later. But what's important to them? What do they see as worthwhile? What do they see as something they want to contribute to the world? It's meaningful to them. So those value systems are unique to each of us. They're born out of years of experience and life lived, and unfortunately, we won't ever really be able to access all the parts of another person's system. They're just so nuanced and varied and not ours. So in that vein, the best we can really do is try to work hard to understand someone. And that's where all of this today is ultimately going to bring us to at the end, which is that motivation plan. It's going to be asking you to sit with someone and try to unpack what exactly it is that motivates them underneath all of that. So if you think about your colleagues, especially if you're a manager, your direct reports, hopefully you're preparing yourself for what I hope will be a fruitful conversation. But it could also be, at some points challenging and if nothing else, insightful. All right. So there's a lot of research on motivation, and it kind of branches out into different, from students in school to workers in the workplace to life in general. So there's a lot of different dimensions of motivation. These are two very foundational concepts. The first of these is extrinsic and then intrinsic. So maybe just in the chat, you can give me a Y for yes or an N for no. Are these at least a little bit familiar to you? Kind of give me a gauge of where you're at. Cool. All right. Thank you for, and that's kind of all I need to know. You don't have to be an expert. I assume we've probably heard these words, but it's always good for me to gauge where you're at in terms of your understanding. So we're going to go through these, kind of define them a little bit. I'm going to give you some examples, and then I think probably the chat bar would be a good place for that, for this next piece. But then I'll ask you to kind of share some examples that you can think of. That'll tell me, is this resonating? Does this make sense? We can go from there. So extrinsic motivation is from without, right? It's outside of us. It's not something that's part of my value system necessarily, though it would connect there. But it's coming from outside of me. It's something that's motivating me in my environment, in the context of my life at that point. So some examples might be, there's an opportunity for promotion, so you work a little bit harder, right? Or maybe you go to a friend's event because if you don't go to that friend's event, your friend might be mad at you, right? So these are things that are happening outside of us, but we might exhibit a behavior based upon them. So you might work hard for a promotion. You might go to a friend's event. What are some examples? And you can use your mic or the chat. What are some examples you can think of extrinsic motivation? The PTA. Well, so let me ask, Melody, while other folks are sharing, what motivated you to join the PTA? Hi.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Well, I would say you kind of get to know some of the people on PTA for one thing. You become friends, and so you think, okay, at least I'll know these people. It'll be a little bit of fun. Also, my kids enjoy seeing me when I can be part of any of the events that I'm able to attend. So there's that motivation of making your kid happy, and then there's the external motivation of continued friendships and building some bonds. And then you also get you get a good idea of what's going on in the school. You feel a little bit more involved in what's happening in your kids' everyday life when you're able to do it.
Now, I'm going to keep you on here for a minute because I think you're right. I think that the PTA has, and we'll talk about intrinsic motivation in a minute, but I think there's some examples of the PTA being both. I'm wondering if if the workload at the PTA ever feels like a bit much, like there's some stuff if you could choose, you wouldn't do.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's what. Yeah. Obviously, I can't do too much working and all, but there's those that do an awful lot. So they try and meter it out wherever possible and ask for as much help as possible because it can be quite a lot.
Mm-hmm. So do you ever feel like if you didn't do something, you'd be letting everybody else down?
Me personally, not so much.
Interesting.
No, because obviously, you do what you can, and then whenever I can help, I do. But I also just kind of set that expectation in the beginning, saying, I can do this much, so that I'm not disappointing anybody.
Okay. See, I asked that because this actually is a little bit personal for me, but the board of the nonprofit that I started is similar to a PTA in that it's comprised of parents and me. And we've without getting into too many details, had a pretty heavy lift to do lately with a bunch of new hires and stuff going on there. And we had these constant conversations that all of us were there just essentially volunteering our time. And it was becoming stressful, but we didn't want to let anybody down. And in my mind, I thought, well, that's an extrinsic motivator, isn't it? Because you're basically telling me you wouldn't do this work except for the fact that there's a social pressure, right? That you don't want to be seen as not helping out the community. So you do it anyway.
Yeah, as much as possible. You don't want to overwhelm yourself, right? So that's why I don't feel too bad if I can't do something. I just know where my limits are.
Yeah. And you're still raising your children, so
right.
They're not suffering so much. Anybody else? We got some other examples coming in from Rose: balancing a training schedule and maintaining a nutrition plan to do your best in competition. So that's interesting, Rose. In that one, I see some sort of intrinsic, which again, we haven't identified too much. We haven't talked about too much yet, but also some extrinsic stuff, right? So there's probably your intrinsic internal drive to do well. But then I would imagine, and Rose, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's also a desire to, so see, that all to me feels intrinsic, that feels internal to me, but is there also some pressure, either real or perceived, that you want to excel in that community, in that world, right? You want to be seen as, a top competitor. Yeah. Okay. So a little bit of both. Let's see, Claire, you have a deadline to design and facilitate a training, and there'll be 20 people staring at you, and you need to, well, that's very familiar to me. So it's interesting. And I think that this is a good time for us to move toward intrinsic, because we can start to see that there's singular events can hit us from both sides. So intrinsic, we're saying extrinsic comes from without, right? It's outside pressure that's motivating us to perform or to behave in a certain way. Intrinsic is something that's inside of you. So working hard because you enjoy the work. For example, I have had a without getting too gross, I live here in San Francisco. I had a bed bug incident that essentially forced me to throw out everything in my room, and that was not fun. That was an extrinsic motivator. I did not want to throw out the things in my room, but I was forced to, obviously for hygienic reasons. But the rebuilding of that room became a really fun project for me, and so I would give up whole weekends, or I could have gone off and done whatever to essentially do work. But I really enjoyed creating my space and trying to make it a nice place to be. So hobby would be another example. I probably have a really dumb hobby, which is my car. I'm not a mechanic. I don't really know how to work on hobbies, but for some reason I keep throwing money at it and trying to make it cool. So that's my little weak point. What about for you all? What are some examples that you have of intrinsic motivation? Something you're just motivated to do out of passion, love, joy. No one's asking you to do it. You just really like doing this thing.
I can share one. This is Sejal. So I just recently certified as a college admission counselor, and every few months I have a lot of friends who have kids who are high schoolers and getting ready for the college applications. I will do an info session with them, focusing on a few different parts of the application based on what grade their kids are. And that's just totally because I enjoy this and I'm passionate about this topic.
Yeah, you mentioned that before most people joined. You and I were chatting and just kind of getting to know each other. And I did wonder. I'm glad that you shared that example, because I did wonder. That's given your background in L&D, and then I thought, okay, well, broadly this is education, but this doesn't really seem to fit. I wondered where that came from. So that's
yeah, actually my master's degree many years back was counseling college students.
Oh, okay.
And then I ended up in the L&D world because I moved to Bay Area. I got married, moved to Bay Area and stuff. So it just sort of went back to doing something I enjoyed and I studied.
Mm-hmm.
And more, like I said, just taking a break and pursuing something of passion.
Well, and you bring up an interesting example as well. I think for folks who are fortunate enough to attend college, that moment when you pick what you're going to dedicate your studies to. And I think that there's some interesting examples of intrinsic or extrinsic motivators there, because some people will choose a degree that they feel is setting them up for economic success. So there's a little extrinsic, external motivation. And then there's people like me who just really liked history and wanted to learn more about it. And that, of course, ended up in a totally different field. Well, bit of a parallel field. So that would be a great example. And Rose, I would say, well, see, and I was thinking, for you, Rose, there's a bit of both, right? You're a competitor, and I think there's actually a whole bunch of literature about competitive motivation as well. But I think that when I think about my understanding of, I was never a competitive athlete, but some of that is intrinsic. It's that internal drive to succeed, and the joy that you get from competing. And then there's that extrinsic, sort of social pressure in those spaces to excel and perform and to be seen and valued as a top competitor. So I think your jiu-jitsu example would fit both, I think. So these are two just core fundamental understandings that we should have about what's motivating people. Oh, I'm going to take a second to read Krista's here. Krista, you direct and produce theater productions. That's cool. And I think you've demonstrated a good understanding of the concept as well, right? There's a passion piece, but also if you fail, if you don't put on a good production, there's a lot of social pressure. Go ahead.
Yeah. And a lot of people would get let down, but it's also it's also career. Yeah, there's a lot of requirements, right, that are coming from funders or other sources.
Okay. So I'm thank you all for, let's see, we've got Claire as well. Producing good work, right? So that would be a good example of intrinsic motivation. And it's kind of an interesting thing to think about when we start talking about values, you know, and the notion of good work. I'm thinking of a friend in my life specifically who I've known for years back, like when I went to college, and we met waiting tables together. And like good work for work's sake, that's something that she valued. For me, waiting tables was a means to an end, and I was in my 20s and wasn't really a passion of mine. And I'm sure if you asked her, she would tell you I wasn't the best restaurant worker. Great with my customers. All the side work I just couldn't, you know, get up for. But I remember having a conversation with her at that time that, you know, she would wash underneath the stools because she wanted to be seen as a hard worker and took pride in good hard work. And for me, like I do in things that I care about and things that I don't care as much about, I'm less motivated for. All right, so great. Okay, so what? Why do we care about any of this? So the main thing that we want to think about as we reflect on ourselves and what motivates us and our extrinsic and intrinsic motivators, and I think you've all done a really good job identifying areas of your life that are, you know, intrinsically or extrinsically motivate you, or where they are both. And I think having that understanding of yourself, that self-awareness, is a great place to start. Because we can understand how it feels when we are motivated by something, and maybe even hopefully over time, you know, having a little voice that helps us differentiate, like, okay, so what's motivating me to work hard right now? Is it I love doing this, or is there something external, you know, some external pressure that's sort of making me do this? Because then what we really want to do is be able to carry this over to the people around us, especially at work. So if you see somebody who, you know, somebody finished a project and they work super hard on it, you can have that discussion with them, and that can come out later today when we talk about the motivation plan. But ask people, so what inspired you to do something with focus or intensity or dedication? Because often the lens through which we operate is our own understanding. Well, that work doesn't excite me. I wouldn't have worked as hard on that, or that work would excite me. Why didn't you work as hard on that? So noticing those moments when someone seems to be really pushing hard and giving it their all, it's a great moment to ask that person, like, hey, what's going on for you right now? Because ultimately, you know, knowing what types of things motivate another people to act in a certain way can give us insight